I used to believe that blood made you family. But when I turned 18, my stepfather called me a bastard and threw me out with nothing but a torn backpack and my father's old watch. 9 years later, I stood behind the gates of my oceanfront mansion as those same people, the ones who once called me trash, begged to move in. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I just smiled and locked the gate. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay until the end, because this story isn't just about revenge. It's about redemption. My name is Ethan Carter, and I'm 35 years old. I live in a glass and stone mansion overlooking the Pacific Ocean, a place so peaceful that even the sound of the waves feels like forgiveness. But it wasn't always like this. I wasn't born rich. I wasn't even born welcome. My story begins in a quiet suburb of Richmond, Virginia, where houses looked perfect on the outside. White fences, trimmed lawns, smiling neighbors. But behind our front door, life was far from peaceful. My father died before I took my first breath. My mother, Helen, told me he was a kind man, a dreamer who fixed cars and played guitar on Sundays. She said I had his eyes and his smile. For a long time, that was all I had of him. A few photographs, an old watch, and the way Mom looked at me when she missed him. Then, when I was 7, Mom met Richard Carter. He was everything my father wasn't. Tall, commanding, always dressed in expensive suits, the kind of man who spoke like he was the only person worth listening to. He owned a construction company and lived by one rule: control. At first, I wanted to like him. I really did. I remember standing in the kitchen one afternoon, trying to impress him by helping Mom bake cookies. He walked in, glanced at me covered in flour, and said, "Boys shouldn't be in kitchens. Go wash up." It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it, like I was already in his way. When they got married, everything changed. Richard moved into our small house and filled it with new furniture, new rules, and a silence that wrapped around everything. Mom quit her job at the library because he wanted her home. I started doing extra chores, trying to be useful, but nothing I did ever seemed right. Richard didn't raise his voice often, but when he did, it echoed through the walls. "You're not my responsibility, Ethan," he'd say. "You're lucky I let you live under my roof." It wasn't long before I realized that home was just a place where you slept and hoped not to be noticed. When I was 9, my half-brother Mark was born. I still remember holding him for the first time. Tiny, red-faced, crying so hard that Mom laughed. "He likes you," she said. For a moment, I believed it. But from the day Mark opened his eyes, he became Richard's world. New crib, designer baby clothes, endless toys. Every photo on the mantelpiece was of them, father and son. There was never a picture of me. I got used to being invisible. I'd eat dinner in silence while Richard told stories about business deals and golf trips. Mark would laugh, copying every word his father said. I sat quietly, staring at my plate, wondering why I even bothered to show up. Mom tried to balance things. Sometimes, late at night, she'd sneak into my room and sit on the edge of my bed. She'd whisper, "I'm sorry, sweetheart. He's just difficult." I'd nod and pretend not to care, but I did. Deeply. As I grew older, Richard's disdain sharpened. He'd make subtle remarks that burned long after they were spoken. "You've got your father's stubbornness," he'd sneer. "Guess it runs in the bastard bloodline." Mom would flinch every time he said that word, bastard. It was poison he dripped slowly, making sure it sank in. By the time I hit 13, I understood exactly what it meant to be unwanted. Mark, on the other hand, was pampered, praised, protected. Richard taught him golf, took him on business trips, bought him his first car before he could even drive. I learned how to change oil and patch walls, because someone had to maintain the house while they were gone. Mark started to change too. The kindness he had as a child faded, replaced by the arrogance he learned from his father. He'd call me names: charity case, half-blood, maid's kid. Sometimes, when his friends came over, they'd laugh about how I had to mow the lawn while he played video games. Mom would scold him, but her words had no weight in that house anymore. Richard made sure of it. One winter evening, when I was 15, I overheard them arguing in the living room. Richard's voice was low, but sharp. "He's not my son, Helen. Stop pretending he is." Mom cried, "He's still mine." Then came silence, broken only by the sound of something shattering. A glass, maybe. That night, I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. I decided that once I turned 18, I'd leave. I didn't care if I had to sleep in my car. I'd find a way to survive without them. But life had one more cruel lesson waiting for me. When I turned 16, Mom gave me something she'd been hiding for years, my father's watch. "It's not much," she said, placing it in my palm. "But it's proof that love existed before all this." I wore that watch every day. It became my anchor, the one thing that reminded me I came from more than bitterness and shame. As high school ended, I started working odd jobs, cleaning garages, painting fences, doing anything that paid a few dollars. Richard didn't like it. "People will think we can't provide for you," he said. I wanted to tell him the truth, that he never provided anything but resentment, but I bit my tongue. Mark, meanwhile, started helping at his father's company, wearing suits, bragging about meetings he barely understood. He was the golden sun, and I was the shadow that followed him. Still, I held on to a tiny spark of hope that maybe, when I graduated, things would get better. Maybe Richard would see that I wasn't a burden. Maybe he'd respect me. But I was wrong. So very wrong. Because the night I turned 18, all those quiet years of hatred came to a violent, unforgettable end. I still remember that night like it's carved into the back of my mind. The smell of roasted chicken, the glow of candles on polished silverware, the faint hum of jazz playing from Richard's expensive stereo. It was supposed to be my birthday dinner, my 18th, the night I officially became an adult. But in the Carter household, birthdays weren't about celebration. They were about control. I came home from my shift at the auto shop that evening, still wearing my grease-stained jacket. Mom met me at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Go upstairs and change, sweetheart," she said softly. "Your stepfather wants everyone at the table." The way she said once made my stomach tighten. When I walked into the dining room, Mark and Richard were already seated. Mark was wearing one of his tailored shirts, the kind Richard used to buy in bulk for him. He looked at me and smirked. Finally decided to show up? I ignored him and took my seat. Mom placed a plate in front of me and sat down beside Richard. For a moment, there was quiet, just the sound of knives and forks against porcelain. Then Richard cleared his throat. "Tonight's a special occasion," he began, looking straight at Mark. "I'm proud to announce that Mark will be taking over the Carter construction business after he finishes college." Mom smiled weakly. Mark straightened his back, grinning from ear to ear. "Thanks, Dad. I won't let you down." I looked at my plate, pretending to be focused on the food, even though I hadn't taken a bite. Then Richard turned to me. "And as for you, Ethan," I glanced up. His tone changed, sharper, colder. "Don't expect a dime. Bastards don't deserve inheritance." The word bastard hung in the air like poison gas. Mom froze, her fork slipping from her hand. I swallowed hard. "I never asked for your money." He chuckled darkly. "Oh, please. You think working in a garage makes you a man? You're lucky I didn't throw you out years ago." Mark laughed under his breath. "Guess being a charity case runs in the family." Something inside me snapped. "You know what, Mark? At least I work for what I have. You just sit back and wait for Daddy to hand it over." His chair screeched as he stood. "What did you just say?" "Don't," Mom whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, both of you." Mark shoved the table aside, sending a glass crashing to the floor. Then he swung. His fist connected with my jaw before I could react. The pain was instant, white-hot, blinding. Mom screamed, "Stop it," and tried to push him away. I stumbled back, blood filling my mouth, then shoved Mark off me. He fell against the sideboard, knocking over a vase. Richard slammed his fist against the table. "Enough!" His voice boomed through the room. "Get out of my house." I stared at him, dazed. "What? You heard me. You're not my son. You never were." Mom tried to speak, but he turned on her. "And don't you dare defend him. I should have sent him to his real father's grave years ago. That did it." I stepped forward. "Don't talk to her like that." His face twisted in rage. "You don't tell me what to do in my house." He grabbed my collar, but I shoved his hand away. "Your house," I said through clenched teeth. "Everything you touch turns cold. Maybe this place would be better off without you." Richard's face went red. "You ungrateful little." He raised his hand, but Mom stepped in between us. "Please, stop. Richard, please." Her voice cracked. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Not for herself, but for me. Richard pointed toward the door. "Get out, Ethan. Right now. You're done here." I looked at my mother, silently begging her to say something. To tell me to stay, to fight for me. But she just stood there, shaking, tears running down her face. Please, she whispered. Just go before it gets worse. That was the moment I realized she couldn't save me anymore. I turned and walked out the door. The night air was cold and wet. Rain started to fall, light at first, then harder, until I was drenched. I didn't look back. I walked for miles, the taste of blood still in my mouth, my father's watch heavy on my wrist. I had no plan, no home, no money. Just one thought running through my head. I'll never let them break me again. Somewhere between the sound of thunder and my own heartbeat, I made a silent promise that someday I'd build something they could never take from me. I didn't know it yet, but that night, when I walked into the rain, I was walking toward my future. The world had just kicked me out. Now it was time to prove I could stand on my own. The first night on the streets was the longest night of my life. The rain didn't stop until dawn, and neither did the ache in my chest. My clothes clung to me, cold and heavy, and every step felt like walking through quicksand. I had nowhere to go, no money, no phone, and no one waiting for me. By morning, I found myself behind a 24-hour diner, huddled near the trash bins for warmth. The smell of burnt bacon and old grease hung in the air. When the cook came out to dump garbage, I pretended to be invisible. He looked at me, then back at the trash, and shut the door without a word. That's when I realized something brutal. Nobody cared. For the next few days, I survived on leftover food people threw away. Cold fries, half-eaten burgers. I'd drink water from public fountains, wash my face in gas station bathrooms, and sleep behind dumpsters where the security cameras couldn't see me. Every time I thought of Richard's words, "Bastards don't deserve inheritance," something inside me hardened. I wasn't going to die in an alley. If the world had decided I was trash, I'd learn how to turn trash into something valuable. After almost a week of drifting, I saw a help wanted sign taped to a window of a cleaning company. They needed a night janitor for an office building downtown. I didn't hesitate. I walked in, soaked, exhausted, and told the manager I'd do anything. He glanced at me, probably wondering if I'd steal the mop bucket, but finally said, "You show up on time. You get paid every Friday. Miss one shift, you're gone." That was my first break. For months, I worked the graveyard shift, mopping floors, emptying trash bins, scrubbing toilets. I'd clean conference rooms long after the suits had gone home, imagining what it would feel like to sit in one of those chairs for real, not just clean under them. It was lonely work, but it gave me something I hadn't had in a long time: purpose. That's when I met George. He was in his 60s, bald, with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much. He worked the same shift, pushing his mop in steady rhythm, whistling old country songs under his breath. One night, during our break, he handed me a cup of coffee from the vending machine. "You look like a man carrying the whole world on his back," he said. I chuckled. "Feels like it." We sat on the back steps, watching the city lights flicker through the fog. I told him bits and pieces of my story, not everything, but enough. He didn't judge. He just nodded, took a sip of coffee, and said, "Well, kid, you can either keep drowning in it or build a damn boat." Those words stuck with me. Over time, George became my mentor. He'd worked as a carpenter for 30 years before an accident wrecked his back. Now he cleaned offices to pay the bills, but his hands still remembered how to build. Wood, steel, concrete. "It's all about patience," he said one night, showing me how to fix a broken door hinge in the building. "You rush, you ruin it. You care, you create something that lasts." That was the first spark. On weekends, I started helping him with small side jobs, patching walls, painting, fixing shelves. We'd split the cash, and every dollar I earned went straight into a coffee tin I kept under my mattress at the cheap motel I was renting. George noticed my determination. One evening, as we packed up our tools, he said, "You've got good hands, Ethan. You remind me of myself when I still believed in starting over." "Why'd you stop believing?" I asked. He smiled sadly. "Lost too much, I guess. But maybe that's why you're here. To remind me that there's still time to build something before it's too late." After that, we became like family. Not the kind bound by blood, but by struggle. At night, when the world slept, I'd sit on the rooftop of the office building, notebook in hand, writing goals like they were prayers. Get an apartment. Buy a toolbox. Start a business. Never go back. Each word felt like a promise I couldn't break. Then, one evening, I saw my reflection in the window as I cleaned it. Tired, thinner, but alive. For the first time, I didn't see the scared boy Richard threw out. I saw a man who'd refused to disappear. It took a year before I saved enough for a small apartment. It wasn't much, just one room, cracked walls, a mattress on the floor. But when I turned the key that first night, I cried. Not because I was sad, but because it was mine. No one could throw me out of that place. That apartment became my sanctuary. I filled it with secondhand furniture, tools from pawn shops, and plans scribbled on napkins. George kept teaching me how to cut wood properly, how to use power tools, how to measure twice and cut once. I soaked up every word. He used to say, "Someday, you'll build something that'll make all this worth it." I didn't know it yet, but he was right. One night, as we walked home after a long shift, George looked up at the skyline and said, "You see those lights up there, kid? Every one of those buildings started with a man who had nothing but a plan. Don't ever forget that." I didn't, because right then, in that moment, standing on cracked pavement under a flickering streetlight, I decided that no matter how long it took, I was going to build something that couldn't be taken from me. I wasn't going to just survive anymore. I was going to create. And though I didn't realize it at the time, the foundation of my empire, the one with glass walls overlooking the ocean, was being laid that very night by a janitor with blistered hands and a dream too stubborn to die. It started small, just like most dreams do. I was 20 when I bought my first real toolbox from a pawn shop on 8th Street. It had scratches, dents, and smelled faintly of oil and sawdust. But to me, it was treasure. Each tool felt like a ticket to somewhere better. George and I began taking side jobs around the neighborhood, fixing fences, repairing decks, repainting old storefronts. Word spread fast. People loved that we showed up on time, didn't overcharge, and actually cared about doing things right. At first, we called ourselves G&E Handyman Services. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. We had no office, no website, just two men, a rusty van, and a mountain of determination. Those early years were brutal. We'd wake up before sunrise, load up the van, and work until our hands went numb. Sometimes, we'd get stiffed by clients. Other times, we'd fix things for free because someone reminded us of who we used to be, lost and struggling. But every job taught me something new: patience, discipline, and pride in my craft. When I wasn't working, I was learning. I'd stay up late watching construction tutorials on an old laptop I'd bought from a thrift store. I took online business classes, read about entrepreneurship, and studied how people built companies from nothing. George used to joke, "You're going to end up building skyscrapers one day, kid." I'd laugh, but part of me started to believe it. Then, everything changed the day we got a call from a real estate developer who'd heard about our reliability. He needed a crew to refurbish a set of rundown rental properties on the coast. It was the biggest job we'd ever been offered, and way beyond our capacity. But I said yes anyway. We spent the next 3 months working around the clock. I hired a few extra guys, friends of friends who needed a second chance, just like me. We painted, hammered, sanded, and rebuilt those old properties from the inside out. By the time we were done, they looked brand new. When the developer came to inspect, he walked through the final unit, nodded, and said, "You've got something here, kid. Ever think about expanding?" That was the first time anyone called me kid with respect. 2 weeks later, he sent more contracts our way. With his referrals, G&E Handyman Services became Horizon Restorations, LLC. The name came to me one morning as I watched the sun rise through my apartment window. Horizon meant possibility, something always just ahead, worth chasing. George smiled when I showed him the new business cards. "You've done it, Ethan. You've turned scraps into something solid." But he didn't know the full truth. I wasn't just chasing success. I was running from shame. Every time I made money, every time a client praised me, I'd hear Richard's voice in my head, calling me worthless. And each dollar I earned was my way of proving him wrong. Years went by. We grew fast. I learned how to negotiate contracts, manage payroll, and hire good people. Eventually, I moved into a real office, glass doors, clean desks, the whole thing. George cried the first day he walked in. "You built this," he said quietly. "All of it." I wanted to tell him it was because of him, that without his guidance, I'd still be lost, but he already knew. As Horizon grew, so did our reach. We started renovating luxury homes, hotels, and oceanfront properties. I began traveling, Miami, San Diego, Seattle, signing deals I never thought I'd be part of. And then came the project that changed everything. A full-scale rebuild of an abandoned estate overlooking the Pacific. It was massive, 5 bedrooms, marble floors, infinity pool, private dock. The owner had gone bankrupt, and the bank wanted it restored before selling. It was the kind of job big construction firms usually got. But somehow, it landed in my lap. I poured everything into it. For months, I lived on site, sleeping on a cot in the master bedroom while my crew worked. Every detail had to be perfect: the glass, the stone, the lighting. When it was done, the property looked like something out of a dream. A few weeks later, the bank put it up for auction. On a whim, I attended. I didn't plan to bid. But as I stood there, staring at the house I'd rebuilt with my own hands, something inside me whispered, "Why not?" The bidding started low, then climbed fast. My heart pounded. I didn't have as much money as the real estate moguls in the room, but I had something they didn't: fire. When the auctioneer called my name as the final bidder, the room went quiet. I'd just bought the mansion. My mansion. I didn't even realize I was crying until George grabbed my shoulder and said, "You did it, kid. You finally built your own horizon." We spent the next few months furnishing it together. Every room had a story: the oak table we restored, the window frames we sanded, the floorboards we laid by hand. It wasn't just a house. It was a monument to everything I'd survived. George moved slower those days. His back hurt more often, his breath shorter. But he refused to stop helping. One afternoon, while we were installing shelves in my office, he said quietly, "You know, I've seen a lot of men chase money. But you chased freedom. Don't lose that." I nodded. "I won't." A week later, George didn't show up for work. I found out from his neighbor that he'd passed away in his sleep. I sat in that half-finished office for hours, staring at the shelves we built together. His hammer still sat on the desk. For the first time in years, I cried. Not because I was broken, but because I finally realized I wasn't alone. Someone had believed in me, and that was enough to carry me forward. I kept his hammer. To this day, it hangs in my office. With George gone, I threw myself deeper into work. Horizon restorations expanded across states. By the time I was 30, I was worth more money than I could spend in a lifetime. But even then, sometimes late at night, I'd stand on my mansion balcony, looking out at the ocean and wondering, if my mother were alive, would she be proud? And if Richard or my brother could see me now, what would they say? I didn't have to wonder for long. Because one morning, as the sun rose over the waves, a black SUV pulled up outside my gate. And the past I'd buried for 9 long years came knocking. The morning air smelled like salt and jasmine. Waves crashed rhythmically against the rocks below my balcony. It was one of those mornings that usually reminded me why I fought so hard to get here. But that day felt different. Heavy, unsettled, like the calm before a storm. From the second-floor terrace, I spotted movement at the gate. A black SUV idled there, its windows tinted, its engine rumbling like a threat. I frowned. I wasn't expecting anyone. My assistant, Claire, came out onto the patio holding my coffee. "You expecting company?" she asked. I shook my head. "No appointments today." She handed me the mug, then glanced toward the driveway. "Want me to check?" "Yeah, please." I watched her walk down the stone steps toward the intercom. I couldn't hear what she said, but after a few moments, she turned back to me, her face pale. "Ethan," she called, hesitating. "There's a man and a woman out there. They say they're your family." The words hit me like a wave. Family? I didn't have one. Not anymore. Still, I walked toward the gate, each step slower than the last. When I reached the security monitor beside the entrance, I saw them clearly through the camera feed. Richard, and beside him, my brother, Luke. I hadn't seen them in 9 years. But time hadn't softened them. Richard's once dark hair had gone mostly gray, his face sharper, his eyes still as cold and judgmental as the day he'd thrown me out. Luke looked older, broader, wearing the kind of expensive clothes that screamed money and misery at the same time. Standing slightly behind them was a woman, Luke's wife, Natalie. She was the reason we'd stopped speaking. My chest tightened. Richard leaned toward the camera. "Ethan," he said, voice gravelly but commanding. "We need to talk." I could have turned away. I should have. But something in his tone, some mix of arrogance and desperation, made me curious. I buzzed the intercom. "What do you want?" My voice came out calm, colder than I felt. "Please, son," Richard said, forcing a smile. "We just need a place to stay for a while." I almost laughed. You threw me out when I was 18. Remember? Your exact words were, bastards don't deserve inheritance. Richard's expression flickered, but he tried to recover. That was a long time ago. Things were complicated. Complicated. I repeated. You mean cruel. Luke stepped forward, his jaw tight. We didn't come here to argue, he snapped. We've had a rough time. The company went under. We lost the house. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitterness roll across my tongue. So you lost your company, I said. And now you want to move into mine. Natalie's voice cut through, sharp and familiar. Ethan, be reasonable. You've got this enormous place, all to yourself. It's just for a few months. I stared at her, memories flashing like lightning. The day she called me trash in front of Luke, the slap that followed, and how my own brother punched me for defending myself. Last time we spoke, I said slowly, you told me I'd never amount to anything. She looked away. People change. Do they? I asked quietly. Luke's face reddened. You think you're better than us now? Because you got lucky. Lucky? I let out a humorless laugh. No, Luke. Lucky is winning the lottery. What I have, I built. Every inch of it. Every drop of sweat. Every sleepless night. Every time I ate ramen noodles while you two dined on inheritance. That's not luck. That's survival. He looked ready to argue, but Richard raised a hand. Enough, he said to Luke before turning back to the camera. Ethan, we're family. Whatever happened in the past, let's put it behind us. Please. We have nowhere else to go. That word, family, made my jaw clench. Family doesn't throw you out into the street at 18. Family doesn't stand by while your stepfather calls you a bastard. Family doesn't let 9 years go by without a single phone call. Still, part of me hesitated. Against all logic, against all the bitterness, there was a flicker of the boy I used to be, the one who just wanted to belong. Claire appeared beside me again. Ethan, she whispered, what do you want me to do? I looked at her, then back at the screen. My reflection hovered faintly in the glass, overlapping with their faces on the monitor. I didn't recognize myself anymore. The janitor with blistered hands was gone. The man standing there had power, and that power came with choice. I pressed the intercom button one last time. You know what's funny? I said, my tone almost conversational. When you threw me out, Richard, I begged you to let me stay one more night. I didn't even ask for money, just shelter. And you told me that bastards don't deserve comfort. So I learned to build my own. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. You didn't want a son. You wanted a servant. Luke didn't want a brother. He wanted someone to blame. Natalie didn't want family. She wanted status. You all got what you wanted. I paused, letting the silence stretch. Now it's my turn. Then I smiled. The same calm, polite smile that drove people crazy because they couldn't tell if it meant mercy or victory. Enjoy your drive back to wherever you came from. And with one smooth motion, I pressed the button that locked the gate. The metal clicked shut, and the sound echoed like closure. Outside, Richard pounded the bars. Ethan, don't do this. We're family. I turned away, heading back toward the house. Claire watched me go. You okay? I nodded, though my chest felt tight. Yeah, I said softly. Just closing an old door. From the terrace, I saw the SUV still parked by the gate. They stayed there for a few minutes, arguing, gesturing, desperate. Then, finally, it drove away, disappearing down the coastal road. I stood there long after they were gone, listening to the waves. The peace I expected didn't come. Instead, a strange ache settled in, a quiet reminder that even victory has a price. But as the sun climbed higher and light spilled across the glass walls of my mansion, I realized something. They had built their world on cruelty. I had built mine on resilience. And no matter how heavy my heart felt that morning, I knew I would never let that gate open again, not for them. The sound of the gate locking echoed in my head long after the SUV disappeared down the road. It should have felt like victory, like the ending of a story I'd been rewriting for 9 years. Instead, it felt hollow. I walked back into the mansion, past the marble foyer and the ocean view windows that used to make me feel powerful. But that morning, all I could see was reflection, not of success, but of the boy who once stood in the rain, begging to be let inside. Claire followed me quietly, unsure if she should say anything. You did the right thing, she finally said. Maybe, I replied, setting my coffee down. But it doesn't feel like it. I spent the rest of the day in my study, trying to distract myself with work. But no matter how many emails I answered or contracts I reviewed, I kept hearing Richard's voice. That same tone he used the day he threw me out. You don't belong here, Ethan. You never did. Funny thing was, now he was the one who didn't belong. And still, some part of me pitied him. That night, I went into the attic, a place I rarely visited. It was filled with boxes, old blueprints, spare tools, and dusty pieces of my past. I opened one labeled Mom. Inside were photographs, faded Polaroids of my mother smiling in front of a house we used to live in before Richard. She had this soft energy, like sunlight through curtains. I hadn't looked at her pictures in years. There was one photo in particular, her holding me as a toddler on a beach, waves splashing behind us. On the back, in her handwriting, it said, "My Little Horizon." I swallowed hard. That's where I'd gotten the name Horizon Restorations. I just hadn't realized it until now. I sat down on the dusty floor, the house silent around me except for the waves outside. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself remember. After my dad died in a construction accident, it was just Mom and me. She worked long hours as a waitress, saving every penny. When she met Richard, I thought he was a blessing. He promised to take care of us. But after the wedding, everything changed. He became controlling, jealous, cruel in quiet ways. He'd mock my father's memory, belittle my mother in front of me, and call me the leftover. Mom would defend me until he'd shut her down with a glare. One night, when I was about 15, I overheard them arguing. She wanted to open a savings account in my name for college. He refused, saying it was a waste of money on someone else's kid. That was the night I realized Richard would never see me as family. 2 years later, Mom got sick, liver failure, brought on by stress and exhaustion. She never recovered. I remember holding her hand in the hospital when she whispered, "Don't let him break you, Ethan. Build something beautiful." Those were her last words to me. And now, sitting there in the attic, surrounded by her memories, I understood what she'd meant. She hadn't just been talking about success. She'd been talking about healing. Claire knocked on the doorframe softly. "Hey," she said, stepping in. "You okay?" I wiped my eyes quickly. "Yeah, just visiting old ghosts." She sat beside me, picking up one of the photos. "She looks kind." "She was," I said. "Too kind." After a pause, Claire asked, "Do you think you'll ever forgive them? Richard, your brother?" I looked at the photo again, my mother smiling like she still believed in happy endings. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe forgiveness isn't about them. Maybe it's about me." That night, I went down to the workshop in the garage. I hadn't been there in months, not since George passed away. His old hammer still hung on the wall. I took it down, ran my fingers over the worn handle, and whispered, "You were right, old man. It's not about the money." I spent hours building something simple, a wooden frame. Not for sale, not for show. Just something to keep my hands busy. When I finished, I placed my mother's photo inside it. The next morning, I carried it out to the cliff behind the mansion, where the ocean spread endlessly below. I placed the frame on a rock and sat there as the wind tugged at my shirt. "Mom," I said quietly, "I built something beautiful, just like you asked." It wasn't about proving Richard wrong anymore. It was about proving my mother right. As the sun rose over the water, I realized something else. Locking the gate hadn't just been about revenge. It had been about protection, about refusing to let the same poison back into my life. The boy who once begged to be let inside was gone. The man who stood in his place had finally learned that peace doesn't come from approval. It comes from boundaries. Later that afternoon, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single handwritten letter from Luke. "Ethan, I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that Dad's sick. He's lost everything. He keeps saying he wishes he'd treated you better. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve what we did to you. Luke." I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly. My first instinct was to tear it apart, but I didn't. I placed it inside the same box as my mother's photos. Because maybe, someday, I'd be ready to forgive. Not today, but someday. That night, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and stood by the window, watching the waves. For the first time, I didn't feel haunted. I felt free. When people say revenge is sweet, they're wrong. Revenge is temporary. But peace? Peace lasts forever. A few months passed after the letter. The days grew warmer, the ocean calmer. My business kept running, my staff kept working, life kept moving, but something inside me had shifted. For years, I thought success meant distance. The farther I got from my past, the safer I was. But standing here now, watching the tides roll in, I finally understood. Distance doesn't heal you. Understanding does. One morning, I decided to drive out of the city. No destination in mind, just a quiet stretch of road and the sound of the wind through the window. I ended up outside a small town, one I hadn't seen since childhood. The streets were older, the stores smaller, but something about it felt familiar. And then I saw it. A rusted sign that read Sunnyvale Cemetery. I pulled over. For a long time, I just sat there with the engine running. Then, finally, I got out. The air smelled like pine and rain-soaked earth. I walked between the rows of headstones until I found the one I was looking for. Maria Thompson, beloved mother. A light that never faded. My throat tightened. I knelt beside her grave and placed the framed photo I'd built in the workshop. The one where she held me on the beach. "Hey, Mom," I said softly. I came back. The words hung in the air. I told her everything. About the years on the street, the nights working as a janitor, the jobs, George, the mansion, the company. I even told her about Richard and Luke showing up at my gate. When I finished, I sat there for a long time, letting the waves of memory wash over me. Then I whispered, "I think I finally understand what you meant. You said to build something beautiful. I thought you meant a house, but you meant a life." A breeze passed through the trees. Somewhere in that quiet, I felt her presence, not as pain, but as peace. As I walked back to my car, I noticed a small church nearby with a community center next to it. Out front was a group of young men repairing benches, laughing and working under the sun. Their clothes were ragged, but their eyes were bright, the kind of brightness that comes from second chances. I parked and walked over. A man in a faded baseball cap looked up. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "I was wondering who runs this place." He nodded toward the church. "Pastor Miller. We take in guys trying to get back on their feet. Ex-cons, runaways, the homeless. You looking to volunteer?" I smiled. "Something like that." An hour later, I met the pastor, an older man with kind eyes and oil stains on his hands. After a short talk, I offered to fund their renovation program. New tools, better housing, more training. He looked stunned. "That's incredibly generous, Mr. Thompson. Are you sure?" I nodded. "Absolutely. I know what it feels like to start with nothing. Everyone deserves a shot." As I left, one of the young men shouted, "Thanks, man," and waved. His smile reminded me of myself at 18, scared, desperate, but still holding on to hope. Driving home that evening, I realized I was finally free from my past, not because I'd shut it out, but because I'd learned from it. When I got back to the mansion, the sunset bathed everything in gold. I stood at the gate, looking out at the same spot where Richard and Luke had stood months earlier. The metal bars still gleamed, but they no longer felt like a barrier. They felt like balance. A line between what was and what would never be again. I unlocked the gate and stepped outside. No anger, no bitterness, no ghosts. Just me, the road, and the horizon. Later that night, I poured a glass of wine and sat on the balcony with George's hammer and my mother's photo beside me. The ocean shimmered under the moonlight, endless and calm. I thought about all the people who had shaped me, the cruel ones who pushed me down and the kind ones who helped me stand up again. Every scar, every failure, every sleepless night had built something I could finally be proud of. And in that quiet, I whispered, "You were wrong, Richard. Bastards do deserve inheritance. Just not the kind you meant." My inheritance wasn't money. It was resilience, compassion, strength, the ability to rebuild. I looked down at the waves and smiled. Maybe, one day, I'll forgive them completely. Maybe not. But forgiveness, I realized, isn't letting people back in. It's letting yourself move forward. And if you're still here, listening to my story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been betrayed by the people you trusted most? Have you ever turned pain into something that made you stronger? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every one of them, because stories like ours remind the world that it's possible to rise from nothing. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing stories about strength, loss, and redemption. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their past doesn't define them, their choices do. Thank you for listening. And wherever you're watching from tonight, I hope you find your own horizon. Good night.